What if everything you thought you knew about Burntrap was completely wrong? For years, many fans have theorized about his true identity, whether he was real or not, but the evidence is pointing to one terrifying answer. There's one chilling theory backed by undeniable in-game clues. So are you ready to have your mind blown and finally get a definitive answer once and for all on Burntrap? Because immediately, the canonical existence of Burntrap is still debated, but evidence suggests he did exist within the story. Now, I know, many people are like, well, which ending was canon in Security Breach to go into Ruin because he's missing in Ruin? Don't worry, I'm going to cover everything. This is going to be the definitive Burntrap video. Now, before we get into whether Burntrap is Afton, whether it's the Mimic, whether it's his own entity entirely, let's actually decipher and uncover whether he actually existed or not. Because as you know, when you play through Security Breach's Ruin, which comes after Security Breach, obviously, Burntrap is completely missing, seemingly replaced by the Mimic. So many people assume that Burntrap just didn't exist yet. You see, Burntrap is only featured in one of the endings of Security Breach, and Security Breach has multiple endings. So the obvious answer is, when you play through Ruin, it'll show us the actual canon ending. Well, that's not entirely true either. Ruin seems to be a combination of multiple endings from Security Breach. You see, at the start of Ruin, it's evident that some type of earthquake occurred, which only happens in one of the endings in Security Breach, and funny enough, that's the one with Burntrap featured, and the Blob, also known as Tangle. How do we know an earthquake actually happened in the events in Ruin? Well, just looking at the papers at the very start of the game, it tells us that an earthquake occurred. And not only that, we also see the Blob in a very short snippet, again confirming its existence, which is only really seen in the Burntrap ending. But this is where things get confusing, you see, because also in Ruin, it kind of confirms that the Princess Quest ending in Security Breach also happened, because we see the destroyed arcade machine cabinets and obviously the sword in Vanny's hideout, indicating that one of the endings basically where we free Vanessa from Vanny's control also happened. And let's not forget, we also see the destroyed Freddy, again indicating that another ending had happened. You see where I'm going with this? So it's kind of showing us that multiple endings were canon rather than just the one, making it even more confusing. So realistically, what's happened is they've cherry-picked certain events from certain endings in Security Breach and put them in Ruin. But that doesn't mean that everything in that ending in Security Breach is now canon in Ruin. So does that mean then they cherry-picked Tangle out of the Burntrap ending and completely left Burntrap out? Because obviously in Ruin, he's nowhere to be seen. But here's the really interesting part. Certain things which indicate he was there are present in the Ruin DLC. Take, for example, the charging pod that Burntrap was in at the end of Security Breach. Although at the point in Ruin, it's actually empty. But what that does imply is that he did exist in that pod at some point. He just isn't there now. Or is it the fact that he just didn't exist? Well, let's continue on because there's even more evidence here. You see, during the playthrough of Ruin, you can pick up comic book drawings done by Gregory. They're just collectibles as you go about the playthrough. And one of them depicts the Blob fighting with Burntrap. Now, if the Princess Quest was the only ending to be canon, where Gregory just simply escapes the Pizzaplex without going down to the basement, doesn't see Tangle, doesn't see the Blob, how would he have knowledge of the Blob and Burntrap to accurately draw them in its entirety and the underground location? He wouldn't unless he knew of their existence, seen them, and that they were real. And let's not forget, there's evidence to suggest that Gregory did in fact go to the underground area. We see his backpack down there, meaning he would have encountered Burntrap or the Mimic and even the Blob at some point, even if the exact outcome was different from the full Burntrap ending. But I know you might be thinking, well, hang on, these comics could actually show us the non-canonical what-if scenarios or Gregory's imagines of escape plans. You see, when you collect these comics, Cassie will usually mention Gregory by name or some type of saying he has an imagination, but the Burntrap comic is different, being described as simply, "What is this supposed to be?" by Cassie, indicating it's a real, unfamiliar entity Gregory actually witnessed. Although we could have another possible explanation. Before Security Breach, we obviously know Gregory was under the control of the Glitchtrap virus. That's how he knew Freddy before and how Freddy knew of him, kind of. But that's a different story and featured in another video. But when he was under Glitchtrap's control, he would obviously be allied with Vanessa/Vanny. Wouldn't he also know of the Mimic/Burntrap? I mean, if they were trying to bring Burntrap back to life, that was their ultimate goal, he'd have memory of this, or at least snippets of it, in his subconscious, and that's probably how he drew it and knew of it. That is another explanation, although not as solid as the others. So whichever way you look at it, we know some of the endings of the Burntrap ending definitely happened, and events from the Vanny's ending happened. So the question has to be asked, if Burntrap did exist, where is he in Ruin? Well, the obvious answer here is, could he have just simply up and left? I mean, we see Tangle literally up and leave the Pizzaplex, never to be seen again after that initial sighting behind the rubble at the very start of the game. If Tangle leaves at that point, a few hours before Burntrap, by the time we get back down to the Burntrap room, just before we meet the Mimic in a sealed concrete room, could Burntrap simply have left? We passed him passing ships, and that's why we never see him. But we do see evidence, obviously, that he was there. The charging pod, certain events which you talked about earlier. It is definitely an explanation, but the confusing thing here is, that would mean that there was a Burntrap just outside of the Mimic's room. Could it be that Steelwool will now combine these two together, their stories intertwined? A William Afton Burntrap outside of the Mimic's room from many years ago, and build their stories together, so they both existed. The Mimic was never Burntrap, Burntrap was never the Mimic. They are actual separate entities. But whoa, hang on a second here. Wasn't it that Security Breach, during its development, Scott was giving them certain bits of information, but not the entire picture? That's why Security Breach and his story, in essence, was a bit of a mess. So could it be then that obviously Steelwool were following Scott's direction in putting this Burntrap character in, and then realized this isn't actually what Scott wanted after they spoke after the game, so had to correct that in Ruin by completely removing Burntrap and putting the Mimic in its place instead. So if they essentially just wiped Burntrap out from existence, although you could argue and say he never existed to begin with because there's different endings, yada yada yada, coping, if you really will, why go through the effort of putting all the evidence in to show he did exist? I mean, they could have just took all of that out in the start, right? They didn't have to put the charging station in there, didn't have to put evidence that he existed, the burners, everything like that, the earthquake. If you wanted to be rid of Burntrap in its entirety and show that he didn't exist, don't put evidence in the game to show he was there. So I don't believe them just to simply poof him from existence. He did exist. Oh, and it's at this point where things get really interesting, because now we have the dilemma of, if he did exist, what is he? If the Mimic is his own separate entity, sealed in that room for, as Gregory puts it, a really long time, if Burntrap existed, who or what is it? Is it William Afton? Is it something completely different? Well, first off, look at the design. We know there's a human being's corpse inside of that mangled old Springtrap amalgamation of metal. Something is in there, a corpse. Now, I'm going to be completely honest here. I don't like the idea of saying there's a Mimic 1 program inside of Burntrap and then also having a Mimic in the adjacent room. That just makes no sense. I mean, why would they literally have the Mimic, the actual Mimic, in the room next to it, and then also have Burntrap as a Mimic 01 program? Narratively, it's completely unsatisfying, and from a design perspective, would make no sense. Because if they decided to do that, that would mean there would literally be two Mimics now. One in Burntrap and the actual Mimic. You see, it's pretty obvious that it was always intended to be William Afton, you know, being found after the burned pizzeria of FNAF 6 down there with the burners, and kind of like a little Easter egg, and I believe that's what Scott wanted and wanted Steelwool to pull off, but it just didn't get communicated well. William Afton was meant to exist there. That's who we meant to find. Burntrap, the remains of William Afton's charred corpse. And they kind of did that to a degree with Burntrap. I mean, he always comes back, right? If the blob survived the fire and becomes an amalgamation of a tangled mess, surely William Afton can, right? And I know a lot of people out there might be saying, well, hang on, who's to say that William Afton didn't become the blob? Well, if that was the case, wouldn't there be a Spring Bonnie head as the main face of it rather than a Funtime Freddy head? If they wanted to show us that that was the remains of William Afton and everything else, they put a Spring Bonnie head in there rather than the Funtime Freddy. They chose Funtime Freddy as the face to show us it's something completely different. It is not William Afton. Burntrap, however, is a Spring Bonnie costume, or Bonnie costume of some sort, has the ears, the face, and the telltale trademark sign of a corpse inside of it. Burntrap is, in my eyes, William Afton. I know you can go down the glitch trap route, but that's what I said earlier. If you're going down glitch trap route, that means it's a Mimic branch, and then that would mean there's two Mimics together down there. Makes no sense. William Afton was Burntrap and then left. The same point the blob left at the very start of the game. That's why we never see him, but we see evidence of his existence, a trail for us to follow. And then, believe it or not, Burntrap's existence does actually line up with the Mimic, because as we know from Secret of the Mimic was built in 1979. William Afton himself knew of his existence because of the emails in Secret of the Mimic. Hell, Fazbear Entertainment sent Arnold in to go and get the Mimic in 1979. William Afton knew of his existence. So wouldn't it be fitting that he's found next to the thing he's been trying to get his hands on for his entire life's work? Somehow there's a connection there, right? The one thing he's been after since the very start, since 1979, was just outside of his reach that entire time. He he was buried along with it when the pizzeria came down. There's definitely some type of connection there, and I hope they explore this further in the Ruin DLC 2 or Secret of the Mimics DLC. We'll just have to wait and see. So to me, Burntrap did exist, and there's a reason why we didn't see him in Ruin, and that's because, just like Tangle, he up and left. But what do you think? I'd love to know your thoughts and theories on this in the comments below. It's a great subject. And don't forget to like and hype the video and subscribe for more content. If you don't subscribe, you'll miss all the upcoming FNAF content. Hit subscribe right now. Massive thanks to the Fazbear Entertainment employees who are on screen now. Lauren, Rena Fox, Amit Jinatapia, Queen Bubbles, and our Twisted Fazbear CEOs Rock Nigel, Bubsalicious, and Penguin Lover 12. Thanks for being a valued member of the Fazbear team. I'm the iconic Twisted Animatronic. Stay safe out there, superstars.